Michael T. Mann graduated in the top 10% of his class from UC School of Law. And it says, as a member of the University of Cincinnati Law Review, his article, Defining a Disability Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, was published. I didn't know that, very interesting. Currently serves on the CBA's Admissions Committee and under Unauthorized Practice of Law Committee, and on the Board of Trustees for Clover Nook for the Blind and Visually Impaired. With
Matt.
Oh, with Matt, really? I have a special affinity for that. Is chair of the LSDMC and SCPA. I don't know what LSDMC is. Thank you. Go, Carol. Michael is also a fellow of the Cincinnati Academy of Leadership for Lawyers. He's been married for a long time to his wife, April, and has 2 daughters, grew up in Cincinnati, and is a graduate of Walnut Hills. So, thank you for being here.
All right, thank you. All right, yeah, thank you for letting me be a part of this, so I really appreciate it. And I do just want to say thank you to all of you for all of the work that you guys do with the CDCs and your various organizations to help make our communities better places. I know that is a lot of volunteer work. We're not obviously getting the key employee salaries that Michelle mentioned, and it often is thankless, but it's certainly appreciated. So a lot of you probably, I know some of you had maybe helped set up CDCs some time ago or more recently, but a lot of you probably have joined CDCs that were already created. So I'll follow up a little bit on some of the control and compliance things from a legal perspective, but I did just want to start talking about what a CDC is a legal entity. As you know, CDCs play very important roles in the communities, and like community councils and redevelopment corporations, they're very involved and carry out neighborhood objectives, and they interface with the city and the county. And I always thought of them as sort of quasi-governmental in a way, but I was a little surprised when I set up the first CDC I did for a client that they really at their core are just Ohio nonprofit corporations. So just like any other Ohio nonprofit corporation. So they're governed by a particular statute, but there is a lot of flexibility within that statute that allows CDCs to form for a variety of different reasons. As we all know, nonprofits are not in business to make a profit for any individual or for the owners, so there is a charitable purpose that's there. But that purpose can be for any lawful purpose, and there's not really a statutory definition of what a CDC is. So, and I point that out because that is distinct from a couple other types of organizations that might be similar to CDCs. For example, community improvement corporations, which have their own section in the Ohio statutes about how they're created. They're very specific, more governmental, and that would be something like the Hamilton County Land Bank. And then there is a statute that speaks to developmental corporations, which would be different than CDCs. It would be something like 3CDC, which has very, very specific statutory requirements to set them up. It's got to be 10 or more people to form them, and they're doing different types of work. So just want to point out sort of the statutory distinctions there. But at their core, CDCs are nonprofits. So it's important to note a nonprofit corporation in Ohio is not automatically tax exempt. So 2 different things. You can have a nonprofit that may not be tax exempt, especially for 501c3 purposes that Michelle was talking about. So to create a nonprofit corporation, you file articles of incorporation with the Ohio Secretary of State. But then if you want to become a nonprofit tax exempt organization, you would have to take the next step and file for the tax exemption with the IRS, which you do with 1023, and now there's an EZ form, and it's a lot simpler than it used to be. So just remember, you've got nonprofits, and then separate from that is the tax exemption part. So in starting a CDC, if the organization you work with was started a long time ago, somebody would have filed articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. It's a pretty basic process. Now you pay $99, you submit a very straightforward form, and you can set up a nonprofit. If you are doing certain types of work, or you want to become a tax-exempt organization, then your articles of incorporation have to be a little bit more specific, and probably something that's important to go back and review just to make sure that what your CDC is doing is in line with what your articles of incorporation say. But I would just point out two important things to have in your articles of incorporation, what I would call sort of magic language requirements. One is if you are a CDC that wants or has a tax exemption, your articles of incorporation will have some language that the IRS requires about the purpose, and which has to be charitable, and there's some language that goes in there. And then what happens if the corporation is dissolved and where the assets go. And if you guys have any questions about that, Michelle and I'm sure can give you that sort of magic language. The other one that I encounter a lot, because I do a lot of nuisance abatement work with some nonprofit organizations, is that if you are working with a CDC that is interested in cleaning up blighted property and using Ohio's nuisance abatement statute, you have to be a nonprofit that has as one of its goals improvement of housing conditions in the neighborhood or in the community, and so that needs to be in your articles of incorporation too. So just a couple things to point out like that. As I said, it's just good practice if you are new to a CDC or were not part of setting up the CDC, you might want to just go back and look at the articles of incorporation. You can pull them off the Secretary of State's website if you don't have them yet.
And are those amendable?
Yeah, and you can amend them, exactly. So if they need to be amended, it's unlike the reinstatement process that Michelle was talking about, they're not fixed in stone. So I think you pay a $50 fee or something to the Secretary of State. You can file it online now if you have online filing access, and it's pretty straightforward. Just amend them. You need to have approval by the board to do that. So, and that just gets checked off or submitted with the form. Yeah.
And what again are the key elements of the articles of incorporation that we need to make sure they're in there, and we need to make sure they're current?
Yeah, so just to set up a nonprofit in Ohio, there really is not much that goes into the articles. You don't have to, there's no duration that's required. A lot of the things that you will see on the form is just optional things, and most people just skip through them. So, and it can be for any lawful purpose, so you don't even have to have a designated purpose. CDC, since they tend to do specific things, and if you want the tax exemption, then you have to have the magic IRS language about the charitable purpose and the dissolution process. And then again, the only thing I've really encountered that is significant in what I do with CDCs is the language for the nuisance abatement statute. Otherwise, somebody just signs off on it, whoever's incorporating it, and that's it. So it's going to be pretty basic. They don't have to reference the bylaws. Yeah, they don't have to reference the directors or anything like that. So the IRS probably requires more of that information when you do your tax returns. But for setting this up with the Secretary of State, I'll go over the one thing that might get, a few things that you might need to update. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Well, it was a two-part question. I think John was answered the
Sure.
second part. The first one is, even if nothing changes, don't you have to every 5 years?
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Okay, and
Yeah.
then if some people who originally signed the Articles of Incorporation are no longer on the board, then you have to.
There's not really an update for that part. So what you were referring to, so a couple things that you may need to periodically update with the Secretary of State just to stay compliant. One, if your registered agent changes, so the registered agent is the person who gets mostly junk mail, but also would get legal notices. So if somebody has a claim against the CDC or sending some sort of legal notice, the registered agent is the person that is on the Secretary of State's website or in their records that would get that notice. And, with, not every CDC has a Paul Rudemiller who stays for 40 years, so often there is changeover, and sometimes that registered agent gets missed. So it isn't, that's something you can just go into the Secretary of State's website, type in, search your CDC's name and make sure that that registered agent's name and address is current. If it's not, I think it's a one form and a $25 fee to do that. The other thing is every 5 years, and this is again where the address on record with the Secretary of State, they will send you a notice saying you need to do your statement of continued existence. And that gets missed a lot, and I've looked up corporations like, well, you guys are actually dissolved at this point because you didn't file this with the Secretary of State. It's a simple form just to say, yes, we're still in existence, and you pay a small fee and get that filed. So by law, if you don't do that, the Secretary of State will dissolve the corporate, it will physically cancel the corporation. And then it'll keep the name for 1 year. So after 1 year, if somebody else comes in and says, I want to start a CDC, and I really like the name they use, they could start a new CDC with your old name, and even though you may be in business, the Secretary of State thinks you're not. So those are two really simple things just to remember, and as people transition through the CDC, those are the kind of things that, from a legal standpoint, should be passed off. And say, all right, just remember, check your address, check make sure you keep us in existence. And, to reinstate it's not hard, but you don't want to miss it. It could lead to problems if somebody else wants to take the name, or if you think you're doing business as a corporation and you're not really a corporation. So, does that answer that? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Are you saying you can be a state nonprofit and a federal nonprofit? You could be a state nonprofit without being a federal?
Well, there isn't a federal nonprofit. So throughout the 50 states, you can create a corporation, a nonprofit corporation. What goes through the IRS is your tax exemption.
Oh.
And there may be a process in Ohio. So as a nonprofit, you're not tax exempt automatically. And there may be some things that Michelle could speak a little bit better than I could about an Ohio nonprofit, what tax benefits they might get. Like, say, I think you can apply for some sales tax, maybe some real estate tax reductions, things like that. But the entity, the nonprofit, is just a state entity, a state creature that can get tax exemption through the IRS. Yeah. So that's the distinction. So again, staying current with the Secretary of State, those are really the two things that are important. But you don't have to update directors or anything like that, which those things might change. That gets a little confusing. I mean, even sometimes attorneys may set up these corporations or limited liability companies. So, for example, my name might be listed for companies that I set up and I'm not part of. So, so the Secretary of State's records aren't always right about the incorporator. May not be the person who's still involved with the company. So, and then you got to stay current with your corporate organization. So. You should have a board of trustees, the governing body. With board of trustees, board of directors, could be called either one. So, and Michelle talked about some of the things that, in terms of the controls that the board and the officers should be doing, and that's why it's important to have that board structure to make sure that's in place to kind of oversee the nonprofit, the CDC, to make sure that it's doing things in the right way. So, there should be nominations for the board, there should be elections, and that all is governed by your bylaws, which in Ohio are called Code of Regulations. So, again, like the Articles of Incorporation, you may have come onto a CDC that has bylaws that were set up 40 years ago, and I would just recommend that if you haven't looked at them in a while, pull them out and update them because, in particular, things like how you give, I mean, your bylaws are going to speak to how many trustees you can have, how long are their terms, how are elections handled, how is notice given, when is notice supposed to be given. The noticing in particular, I find looking at older bylaws is a problem because it might say it has to be given by certified mail or something, or hand delivery or Pony Express. So nowadays it's all fax and email or text or some electronic means. Yeah, so you might need to update your bylaws to make sure that the way you give notice about meetings is done right. You should have meetings, and the bylaw should say when we're going to have the meetings, where they're typically going to be held. Do you have an annual meeting? Things like that. Yeah.
What allows a nonprofit to work with a for-profit?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, you can work together on projects for
Yes,
sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
how does that work? A nonprofit and a for-profit working together, can that be done?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, it's just two businesses working together, two organizations working together. It's just the nonprofit has a different mission, a charitable mission, whereas the for-profit's trying to make money. But I'm not sure exactly what circumstance you're talking about, but certainly CDCs work with plenty of for-profits like contractors and other vendors. Yeah,
Okay.
and you may work with, I mean, you just have to avoid, for example, anything that would conflict with this nonprofit's mission,
Oh,
and it can't be political, I mean, things like that, so.
A lot of CDCs are the nonprofit partner in LLCs,
Yeah.
like for tax credit properties or historic credit properties. So you see that a lot. So
Right.
they may be an owner, like a partial owner in a housing project.
Like a separate third.
Yeah.
Right, and I guess the main issue there would be
It's
just
like a
making sure
separate
that,
company, so there's like a third company, the nonprofit's an owner and the for-profit's an owner of this separate company.
Right. So they form the company
oh, they
together.
form a
Yeah.
company together.
Mhm.
yeah,
Oh,
so
okay.
basically the nonprofit becomes like a shareholder.
Yeah.
But then I guess you just have to worry about your unrelated business income issue.
Yeah, it depends. And that's why CDCs will do that with housing projects because it's in their mission. And I think they get more points if they have a nonprofit partner.
And that may be something that we might also want to train on later, since you start to own more real estate. They can get some pretty complex ownership structures.
Yeah. So bylaws, pull out your bylaws, see if you haven't looked at them. I mean, they should be reviewed annually, just as a good practice. You're probably not going to make changes that often, but if you haven't looked at them in a while, pull them out, make sure that they're updated. If you need help with that, let me know. I have some basic forms. So, and then all board action should be done in compliance with the bylaws. So, and then in addition to the bylaws, corporations, nonprofits, CDCs can have corporate policies. So there are a couple that I just want to highlight that are important, especially from a tax exempt status. One is you should have a conflict of interest policy. So trustees and officers owe a duty to the corporation, and they have to act in the best interest of the corporation. They can't act in their own interest. So can't use the nonprofit as a way to benefit themselves personally. So there's it's a charitable purpose that these entities are set up for, and then nonprofit can't be driven by personal gain. So you should have a written conflict of interest policy. There are plenty of standard ones out there. There are standard ones that comply with the IRS requirements, so the language is out there. They're not complicated. I think the key is having one, looking at it annually, maybe at the annual meeting. Everybody should sign off on it. New members, when they come on, should sign off on it and say, yes, I saw this, I read it. Some examples of what might run afoul of a conflict of interest policy that I could think of in the CDC world might be, for example, a CDC that rents its office space from one of the board members or trustees, and it's paying more than market rent, so the board members benefiting by getting more rent than they would have. Or maybe a CDC owns property and one of the board members is a tenant there and they're paying considerably less than market rent, so they're getting a benefit there. Those would be conflicts of interest. It gets a little more complicated when most of you are probably doing a lot of volunteer work with the CDCs and probably have businesses that you actually earn money from. And if that business happens to be something that maybe could provide a service to the CDC, it gets a little bit more complicated where you're providing services and getting paid by the CDC for those services. As a general rule, it's best just to avoid any appearance of impropriety. But certainly a best practice in that situation would be to make sure, for example, if you run a contracting business and you're going to rehab a house for a CDC, make sure you get some other bids out there and that the CDC isn't paying you more than it otherwise would for other bids. But generally, it's best just to avoid it. So, CDCs certainly come across properties a lot. Another conflict of interest I can think of is maybe CDC sells a property to a board member and it's for less than fair market value. So those kind of things that you might come across. The other important policy to have is an ethics and whistleblower policy. The board has a responsibility to set ethical standards. As Michelle said, that should start at the top, and those standards should, the director, president, whoever's at the top should set those standards so that to set an example for the rest of the members of the CDC. So, and then you need to have a policy that for any employees of the CDC, they have a policy to report any financial impropriety or whistleblower activity. And again, that should be written. It should be reviewed periodically. It should be signed off by new board members and employees. And again, there's standard language for that, so you don't have to create that. So just let one of us know. Should also maintain records of meetings, so there should be minutes. You should maintain records of any financial transactions. The treasurer should be keeping all the receipts and all that kind of stuff. If the board adopts a resolution, there should be a record of the resolution. And as people shift in and out of the organization, just make sure that that kind of information is passed along, either paper copies. More and more I see somebody's like, I just became the secretary on a board that Carolyn and I are on together, so I got all the paper files and a nice disc that everything's on for the last, I don't know, however many years, many years. So, and I'm studying that very hard, and all of that. So yeah, so it's easy to pass it off electronically.
Yeah, and how many years do you have to retain records? I know we were just asking this the other day.
I mean, there's best practices. I don't know that there's a actual rule. I mean, I think for financial purposes, it may be a little bit different. I would a decade. I mean, I would say even longer because
I think IRS it might be seven years.
So,
yeah.
But it's not. Again, if you've got things on an electronic file, it's not that hard to just keep the history. For this organization standpoint, it might be interesting to have that information. So, yeah. So just make sure that gets all passed along. And then I just want to quickly touch on some other legal things that maybe CDCs face and some of the things that at least I've worked with CDCs on from a legal standpoint. Contracts, leases, vendors, contractors. I'm sure you guys are all signing contracts and stuff. I would just make sure, obviously review it before signing it, but I think most importantly is make sure that the person who is signing it for the CDC has the authority to bind the CDC to that contract. And for most cases, it's probably going to be the president or the chair or the executive director. But in particular with land transactions, if there's a title agency or a bank involved, they're going to require a corporate resolution. So, and that goes back to the bylaws. You got to make sure that you follow the bylaws to get the corporate resolution done correctly and signed off by the secretary or whoever is keeping the corporate records. So that comes up a lot in, like I said, in real estate transactions. For CDCs who are big enough that maybe they have employees, you got to worry about all the employment issues. Do you have workers' comp? Do you have to pay into unemployment? Are you doing your tax withholdings property, or are you complying with the Fair Labor Standards Act? Are you paying minimum wage, overtime? All of those kind of issues come into play. So you become, an employer. Maybe you should have an employee handbook. You maybe should have anti-discrimination policies, things of that nature. So, and then a lot of CDCs, I think, end up owning property and maybe end up as a landlord where they have tenants. So eviction issues come up from time to time. I think eviction issues can be minimized if you, on the front end, are doing good screening about the tenants. But I know as nonprofits, certainly we're trying to help people who maybe would have a hard time finding a place to live. So sometimes there becomes issues where rent's not getting paid, or maybe there becomes criminal activity or things like that, and you do need to go through an eviction. The process is relatively straightforward. It's not cheap, and it takes some time. The CDCs have to be represented because they are a legal entity. They can't represent themselves in eviction court, so they have to have an attorney who helps them file and show up at the hearing. But if anybody has any questions about that outside, I'd be glad to talk through. And the last thing I just want to point out, which I'm not sure all of the CDCs know about, which I think is a very effective statute. Ohio has a nuisance abatement statute that allows it allows a few entities. The city can do this, neighbors, so any neighbor within 500 feet of a property can do this, but in particular, nonprofit organizations that have as one of their missions improvement of housing conditions can file a lawsuit on a blighted property and then have themselves appointed as receiver, or have an actual receiver appointed as a receiver who can fix up the property. And the teeth in the statute is that the expenses in fixing up the property then become a lien on the property, and it's a priority lien over mortgages, real estate taxes that are delinquent, any other liens. So you can then either sell the property to get reimbursed for the expenses that you had, or you can go through a foreclosure process too on the lien. I haven't had to do that yet, fortunately. But so it does two things. One, sometimes it just encourages the owner to actually fix up the property, and that can be a good thing. Or it allows the CDC to fix up the property or to work with somebody who wants to develop it, and then it gets in the hands of somebody who's going to live there or use it in a way that benefits the whole community. So I think that can be, it's not right in every case, but for particular cases it can be very effective. It's not a quick process, but again, if there is a problem property that is, it's falling down and you can't figure out what to do with it, that is one thing to look at. So, and then just following up real quick on Stephen's talk, if he was talking about the clerk of court's website and getting access to records, if you ever are on there and you're like, oh, I'd really love to see this document, if you don't have access to attorneys, just let me know. It's not something I would charge for. I can just pull it up and email it to you, so I can just get the document. So, and there are things like the complaint in a tax foreclosure case that might have a list of all the liens in there and the amounts, or maybe a title exam that's been filed or something like that could be helpful. I've also looked stuff up on criminal cases where CDCs are trying to figure out, all right, what's going on with this neighbor and their criminal case, and are we going to be rid of a potential problem. So, all right, that's tax and law, fun stuff. Any questions? Yes?
I belong to a small nonprofit, not the one that I work for, but another
Right.
one. We don't have a staff. We have only about 7 board members. And we're trying to review our bylaws, and they were wondering if there was someone outside of paying an attorney who would review the bylaws, someone that has expertise on it, just to take a look at it and make sure everything's in there that's supposed to be.
Like a person or an entity that does that, like, or I mean, the only thing I can think of, there's can't remember the name of the organization. I know there's a national nonprofit organization that might have some standard bylaws on their website.
There's something called that pro bono something.
Yeah.
Legally,
You
no.
can
Yeah.
there's a way you can pro bono for a nonprofit
Yeah.
and represent your interest in it. I did.
Okay.
Yeah,
Or
there is a
it-
way that an individual can represent their interest in a nonprofit.
Okay. But if you just want like sample bylaws, I can send you sample bylaws. Just ones that I would use. So, and then at least gives you a template to look at. So, yeah, but do they don't have bylaws in it? Oh, okay. So,
And I would reiterate the importance of updating your bylaws. We started looking at ours, and I agree with the Pony Express meeting
Yeah,
this
it's-
May, and we have to get them
it's
updated.
boring and a little bit tedious, but once they're updated, then just look at them each year, and usually you're not gonna have to change it. But sometimes things come up during the course of business, and you're like, I don't know if we can do this because our bylaws aren't updated, and then you run into problems and get stuck. And most bylaws require, board approval, and sometimes it's unanimous, and there may be things in your bylaws that just aren't workable in the current situation.
So I'm